Good afternoon. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming and acknowledge the generous underwriters of Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor Bank of America, Raytheon, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe and WBUR. I am one of the many who can say that the genius of Sargent Shriver changed my life. At a formative moment, I worked one summer as a counselor for Upward Bound, a federally funded program launched by Sargent Shriver to help low-income students become the first in their family to attend college. After experiencing the power of that work, I was hooked, and I went on to work for Upward Bound for 16 years, first in rural Maine and then in the inner cities of Hartford, Springfield, and Holyoke before coming to the library. There are countless others who could say the same, either those whose lives were transformed by the services provided by the many programs that Mr. Shriver created, or those who worked or volunteered for those organizations. Having long revered Sargent Shriver, I was deeply affected by Mark Shriver's new book, A Good Man, Rediscovering My Father, which is on sale in our bookstore, and Mark would be happy to sign your copies after today's forum. And how fitting it is to have Mark here with us this Father's Day weekend, since this book provides insight not only into Mr. Shriver's professional accomplishments, but also his role as a father, a husband, and a friend. The book is a touching tribute from a devoted son of the timeless lessons he learned from both his parents, the durability of faith, the endurance of hope, and the steadfastness of love. And appropriate that we gather here, for Sargent Shriver played a crucial role in the Kennedy administration. Some historians suggest there would not have been a Kennedy presidency, save the advice Mr. Shriver gave to JFK to call Coretta Scott King just days before the vote, a decisive moment that shifted the election in Kennedy's favor. As President Clinton stated in his eulogy, a whole generation of us understood what President Kennedy meant by looking at Sargent Shriver's life. Our moderator this afternoon is Richard Parker, an Oxford-trained economist and senior fellow at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard University and the co-founder of Mother Jones magazine. He writes extensively on public policy and is the author of the biography John Kenneth Galbraith, His Life, His Politics, His Economics. As you might imagine, I read a lot of biographies in this job, but two stand out in my memory. The first is Richard's book on Ken Galbraith, which one reviewer described as fittingly capturing the oversized life of the eminent economist, philosopher, writer, and diplomat. And the other is Scott Stossel's book on Sargent Shriver. Both volumes tell the fascinating backstory of these two happy warriors who played crucial roles in launching the new frontier and then served as the conscience of our nation during all that was to follow. On a personal note, I lost my own father around the same time that Mark lost his. And like many sons, including, as you learn in this new book, Mark Shriver, I often grapple with whether I live up to the model provided to me by my father, whose life, like Sargent Shriver's, was tempted by his experience in World War II as a young man, and who went on to live life to the fullest, having survived that maelstrom. The title of the book comes from how frequently, after his father's passing, Mark heard friends and admirers comment that Sargent Shriver was a good man. Quote, I heard it so often during the funeral, he writes, that it passed from a cliche to a haunting refrain. In reading this book, I thought of another cliche that might be appropriate to describe what we learn about Mark Shriver when reading this powerful new book. When it comes to good men, it takes one to know one. Please join me in welcoming Mark Shriver and Richard Parker to Kennedy Library.
Mark, I want to start by asking you to say how this book came about. This is your first book. You have spent your life in politics and progressive change, working on anti-poverty programs, working on inner-city counseling. What about your father's years caused you to write this book?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for agreeing to come out today, Richard. Really honored that you're here. And Tom, thank you for that very kind introduction. Particularly the last sentence, that was really very, very thoughtful of you, so thank you. I mean, as Tom said, what happened was I never had planned to write a book, much less a book on my father. So what ended up happening was I heard this time and time again that he was a good man. And at first, as I wrote, and as Tom just read, I thought it was something nice that people said to you when your father died. And then I realized that they meant something different than the fact that he was a great man. And when I really started to dig in and try to figure that out, I think it was because he was married to the woman of his dreams for 56 years. He raised 5 kids, all of whom love him. He had countless friends, and not just President Clinton, who spoke at his eulogy, or cardinals or senators, but the 2 women who waited in line at the funeral home for 40 minutes, who literally said to me, your father was a good man, and they were the waitresses at his favorite restaurant. The guy from the U.S. Air counter at National Airport, who I know a little bit, who told me that your dad was he said, your dad is a great man, was a good man. And he turned around and walked out of the church, and I talked to him later, and he told me that it was because when he used to take Dad through the security lines when he was older, that Dad was always asking him how he was doing, instead of talking about himself or talking about his Alzheimer's. So you have these examples that come back to me that start to show why he was a good man. And obviously the fact that he went to Mass every day of his life, literally. And I remember checking into hotels here in the United States and anywhere around the world, and the first thing Dad would ask is, what time is the Mass scheduled? Do you have a Mass for tomorrow? How can I get to Mass? So I wanted to dig in and figure this out. My wife Jeannie and I are raising 3 kids, and we're trying to balance faith, family, friends, our jobs, trying to make a difference in our community, trying to make a difference in Maryland or the country. And it's tough. Families are pulled in so many different directions now. And Dad somehow managed to balance all of those competing interests, to be a good friend, to have a daily relationship with God, to make a difference in the world, to be a good husband. And I wanted to dig in and figure that out. My dad used to write me letters almost every day. And when I was in high school, he'd slip them under the door. And they could be from the night before conversation we had at dinner. They could be an article about a Red Sox-Oriole game. It could be, in some cases, he'd slip a book under the door by Elie Wiesel or an article by Bob Woodward in the newspaper. And I dug into those notes to try to see if I could glean out of some of those notes what it meant to be a good man. And that's what the book is about. It's a story, essentially, of a bunch of stories. How I learned how he became head of the Peace Corps and created the Peace Corps out of nothing. How he created the war on poverty out of nothing. How he worked with my mom spreading Special Olympics around the world. But more importantly, how he balanced being a father, being a husband, being a son of God, being a friend, and doing it all with such joy. And I could read a couple of letters as we go through this, but he really was joyful. I mean, he got fired up every day and was ready to take on the day, whatever it was. And there's a piece in there, I asked him when he was suffering from Alzheimer's, and it was about 4 years before he died, and I thought he had a moment of clarity, and I said to him, Dad, you're losing your mind. How does it make you feel? And without missing a beat, he turned to me and he said, I'm doing the best I can with what God has given me. And I think that's the way he lived his life, whether it was fighting in World War II, whether it was surviving the Depression, whether it was creating the Peace Corps, whether it was being a husband, or whether it was writing us notes, whether it was hitting fly balls, whether it was having a vodka tonic with my friends and a cigar and telling stories. He was doing the best he could with what God has given him. And I learned that as I reflected back on the writing of this book. And I hope that the stories in here are insightful to folks as they balance these different competing interests of fatherhood, friend, relationship with God, relationship with your spouse, and obviously for women as well. So that's a long answer to your question.
It's a thorough answer, and that's worthwhile.
Thank you. Maybe we should just stop right now.
Let me press you a little farther.
That's okay. Are we going to let anybody else ask questions, or you're just
Later. No, I get to own the stage for the next few minutes. Okay. Why, you've got friends planted out in the audience
you want to go to
first?
You're a professor, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I get nervous around professors.
I'll give you an A. Let's talk.
Okay. The only one I would ever got.
We take care of Kennedy School people here, so
Good.
you're okay.
Good.
Talk a little bit about the Shriver family. I think for so many people, one associates the Kennedys with Boston and Irish Catholicism, but that's not where the Shrivers come from.
Yeah, I mean, Dad's family had been involved in the state of Maryland's history, both politically and economically, for over 200 years. I'm going to butcher this, but his great-great-great-grandfather was one of the original signers of the Maryland Constitution. And his grandfather Okay, his grandfather took Jeb Stuart to the Battle of Gettysburg.
As a 16-year-old.
As a 16-year-old.
Right.
So, you know, Dad always talked about the Civil War, and he used to have on his counter bullets from the Civil War that he found as a kid in the Shriver homestead. And we, you know, when I really step back to reflect on this, his grandfather took Jeb Stuart to the Battle of Gettysburg. Stunning, right? And that guy then, after the war, went into the seminary, wanted to become a priest, dropped out because he got sick, went back into the seminary, dropped out a second time because he got sick, but became very good friends with a guy named James Gibbons, who would become the second cardinal in America from Baltimore, James Cardinal Gibbons. And that was Dad's godfather. And his mother and father, who were second cousins, and I said, Dad, God, you're crazy. Well, my parents were second cousins. What did you expect? One was from Western Maryland,
Yep.
and one was from Carroll County, which is the western part of Maryland as well. But that man, who's Dad's grandfather, was in the Maryland House of Delegates in the Maryland State Senate. And the Shrivers ran a very prominent milling facility, milling operation in Union Mills. And Dad said that when he was a little kid, he used to look out the window and he'd see the horse-drawn carts bringing up the corn to be milled. And in that area, which was the post office for Carroll County, was in the Shriver homestead. So people would come and collect their mail. Dad was there as a little kid seeing this. People would come and talk. It's Southern, and you know, they'd sit on the front porch, they'd go on their rockers and talk about politics, about the economy. So we had this great experience of a couple hundred years of a very prominent family in Maryland, very strong Catholic. They were split between the North and the South. Dad's mother's side of the family was Catholic and with the South. His father's side was Protestant and with the North. And literally the day before Jeb Stuart showed up, the Union troops showed up and they went up to Gettysburg. So he had this great history, and that faith, I think, is really the bedrock of his life.
And tell me, your grandmother warned your father when he went off to Yale to be careful about
Yes.
Harvard and Boston. What was that
yes,
about?
well, it's the, you know, they lived in the Civil War, and there were bullets, you know, literally Civil War slugs in the family homestead there. So when Dad used to say that when he came up and tried to play baseball against Harvard, which he did do when he was at Yale, that his mother wouldn't allow him to spend the night because Boston was the heart of the North, and you're not allowed to hang around with the Yankees. So he'd have to get back on the train and go back to New Haven.
The safety of New Haven,
Safety of New Haven. That's ironic, yeah.
It's
Safety of New Haven.
The safety of New Haven.
Yes.
I love the idea.
Yeah.
So, I love it too.
Yeah.
Your grandfather was a successful businessman who then was hit very hard, like so many men in business, by the Depression. And yet nothing about what you describe about your father gives the sense that he, in turn, was crushed by his father's difficulties. How did your father and grandfather get along?
So essentially, they got along, I think, very, very well. My dad, just to give everyone a quick history on it, the Shriver family was in Western Maryland. They moved into Baltimore to go into the banking business. It went very well. And my father would tell stories about his mother and father working with the poor, feeding the poor in Baltimore City, clothing the naked in Baltimore City. And I think their faith was a very active faith. It was the faith of the call to social justice. And then in the fall of '29, of course, the worst timing possible, Grandpa Shriver moved the family up to New York to start a bank, and a couple of years later declared bankruptcy. And Dad has written, and there's some notes in this book about it, as well as in Scott Stossel's excellent biography, about the fact that the Depression really crushed his father. And his father died a few years later, actually in 1942, but was never the same with the same amount of energy. Dad had to work himself through grants and scholarships, through high school at Canterbury, through Yale undergraduate, and through Yale Law School. So I think that faith was tested during the Depression. It was tested when he went into the war. Signed up, literally went into the Navy the day after his final exam from Yale Law School, Harbor. So here was a guy, and then he fought in the South Pacific through brutal combat. Came out of that with his faith even stronger, I think, than when he went in.
You talk about faith, but there's another dimension of faith, in a sense, which was the connection between your father and your mother. He met her, apparently he fell in love with her immediately, and there was a little hesitation, maybe a couple of days or a couple of weeks before your mother would consent to marry your father. Tell a little bit about that.
So this is a Harvard professor trying to be funny. Mommy, they dated for 7 years, right? So when he was saying weeks or months, it being funny.
But a new kind of, but a particular kind of faith, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, well, somebody said to me the other day, the first three sections of the book, or the first section of the book is built into three areas. It's faith, hope, and love. Because what I really distilled in kind of trying to figure out what made Dad a good man is the fact that he believed in those three principles. And those were the guiding principles of his life. The faith that he had that demanded acts of hope and love. And some guy joked to me the other day, the greatest example of faith, hope, and love for your father was the fact that he had faith that your mother, and he hoped that your mother was going to fall in love with him. And it worked out.
It worked out.
Over,
so faith
it took
right.
7 years. They knew each other. They met after the war in New York City. My father had gone to school at Canterbury for a year with Jack Kennedy before Jack Kennedy left Canterbury, so he knew him a little bit. And then he knew my mom's older sister, Kathleen, who died a couple years after the war in an airplane crash. And I think they were in those circles in New York City after the war. And they met at a party.
And then your dad met your grandfather separately, and your grandfather hired your dad?
So what happens is, my mom and dad meet. My father tries to take her out on a couple of dates, and then he gets a call from Joe Kennedy. He's a junior editor at Newsweek, and he gets a call from Joe Kennedy and says, can you come over here? I want to talk to you. So, of course, my dad's like, oh, my God, I somehow agitated Joe Kennedy. And at that point, Grandpa was a big businessman and a big tycoon and whatever. I guess I probably shouldn't say tycoon, but he was a big businessman at that point. And he got called in, and he had been the head of the Yale Daily News, which was at that point and still probably the best student newspaper in the country. So he was, a smart guy who worked himself through Yale College and then Yale Law School. And Grandpa asked him to look at these letters that Joe Kennedy had written Grandpa during World War II to see if they were worthy of being published. And Dad met with him at a hotel, nervous, comes back a couple of weeks later and says he doesn't think the letters are good enough, which is probably required a good amount of guts to say that to Joe Kennedy. Yeah. And Grandpa said, I agree with you, and then calls him back a couple of days later and says, would you like to go run the merchandise mart, which Grandpa owned at that point. It's the biggest building in the world. And he goes to work for Grandpa.
And then courts your mom and finally persuades her to marry. Is that
7
great?
years later.
That's great. Now, in terms of your father's interest in politics, he was apparently active in politics in Chicago even while he was courting your mother, and in particular in early civil rights activity. And say something about that, and then how that connects with the 1960 election and the crucial African-American vote in Illinois in terms of your uncle's election. So
essentially, my father's parents, when they moved to New York, worked on something called the New York City Catholic Interracial Council. And it was an effort in that time, started by the Catholic Church, members of the church, to try to deal with the issues of segregation and the tensions between African Americans and whites, and to foster dialogue, better understanding, and try to solve some of those issues. So when he went to Chicago, there had just started up something called the Chicago Catholic Interracial Council. And Dad became involved in that. Was again, I keep going back to faith, and it's something you'll hear if I talk any longer here about that consistently, because that was I think the driving factor of his life. So when he moves to Chicago in the late 40s rather, he goes and gets involved in the Catholic Interracial Council. He's running the biggest office complex in the world at that point. So he's a big businessman and gets to know Daley, and works with, and then Daley names him the head of the Chicago Board of Public Education. And Dad works on the issues of integrating the Catholic high schools and the Catholic churches, the Catholic hospitals and the Catholic high schools in Chicago with Cardinal Strick, who was actually very progressive on the issue of racial issues in the U.S., and he was a Cardinal in Chicago. So he has these relationships. He introduces King at an event in Chicago. He has bricks thrown through his office window at the Chicago Catholic Interracial Council because of his work on racial issues. So he is, working on these issues in the 40s and into the 50s. And then when Uncle Jack decides to run for president in 1959-60, Dad is named the head of the Civil Rights Unit of the campaign. And he works on that with a guy named Martin, who is publishing, he's an African-American who publishes newspapers. Louis Martin is his name, and Harris Wofford, who had done a lot of work on the issues, and knew King very well, knew Gandhi. And they are running the Civil Rights Unit, which is to issue these position papers on it, but also to get out the African-American vote. And they had been told countless times during the campaign, if Kennedy says anything good about Khrushchev, Castro, or King, the Southern Democrats are going to throw their votes behind Nixon. So what happens is King gets arrested, and a couple of weeks before the election, which Tom alluded to, and people are fearful for his life, and Mrs. King obviously credits Scott King as well. And they come up with the idea that Senator Kennedy should call Mrs. King and express concern. And the campaign structure didn't want to do it because of the threat of losing the South. And Dad gets the idea in a conversation with Wofford and Martin, and races to Jack's hotel room in Chicago, and there are folks in the room. This is how Harris is told, and I've read it a couple of other ways. And the room starts to empty out, and Dad is kind of loitering around there. And Eddie Martin, it's not Eddie Martin, Kenny O'Donnell, sorry. Kenny O'Donnell, it's nice to have Tom in the front row. Kenny O'Donnell, who is Senator Kennedy's closest aide, goes into the bathroom, and Dad says to Jack, you ought to call credit Scott King and just express your concern. And he says, okay, that's a good idea. How do we get her on the phone? Dad pulls the number out, dials her, talk for about a minute. O'Donnell comes out of the bathroom and says, oh my God, you've just lost us the election. And then there's 48 hours of a lot of confusion and chaos. And then Daddy King, Martin Luther King's father, comes out and says, I was going to vote for Nixon. I'm now throwing my votes behind Kennedy. And at that point, he was obviously a Protestant minister, Republican, and said, I'm going to throw all of my votes to Kennedy because he had the courage to call Coretta and wipe away the tears from her eyes. And a whole series of African-American ministers come out in support of Jack over the course of the next 48 hours. Dad produces what they called the Blue Bomb, which is a series of quotes from folks like Abernathy and King and other folks in support of Uncle Jack's move. And the African-American vote moves in such a direction, increases in enough numbers to push the election to Kennedy.
And particularly important in Illinois, where the black vote was so crucial in swinging that state because it was so close.
And it didn't alienate, evidently, it didn't alienate any of the traditional Southern Democratic votes. So he holds that base and then gets enough of the African-American votes in higher percentages to win the election. And a lot of people have said, it was a shrewd political move, and I really don't see it that way. I mean, it may have been, but I really think that deep down inside, again, it's an act of faith that he is trying to deal with the issue of racial injustice in this country. He knew King. He had been involved in these issues for years. And he, I think, saw it as a way to help mend the relationship between African Americans and white people in this country. And it had great political implications, obviously, but I think it was really a gesture of hope. And that's the idea of faith,
and a significant moment in American political history to have a major candidate speak out on civil rights when so often the Democratic Party had to curb its voice on these issues.
Absolutely
in the past.
Right.
So now begins the 1960s and early 1970s, where in some sense this is the peak of your father's public career. Your uncle appoints him to head up staff or cabinet selections for the Kennedy White House, and then charges him with creating the Peace Corps. Talk about what that was like for your father.
Well, I think, again, you said it, but I think it bears repeating. I mean, the best and the brightest, which everyone knows is associated with the Kennedy cabinet, was recruited by Dad. So he goes out, and Uncle Jack gives him the task of being the headhunter, essentially, for the Kennedy administration. And I think he got that job, as I wrote in the book, because Dad had the widest array of acquaintances of anybody in the Kennedy circle. So he went to Yale Law School, and Potter Stewart was his classmate. He was a Supreme Court justice. The other guy who would become a Supreme Court justice named by Kennedy is Wizard White, who had played in the NFL, and he was one of Dad's friends from law school. He knew King, he knew Cardinals, he knew folks all around the country, and he recruited McNamara, Dillon, all of these people to come onto into the Kennedy administration. That in and of itself is a pretty amazing accomplishment. So he takes, after that's over, the day after Kennedy's sworn in, he's asked to come create the Peace Corps, and Dad had had experiences working on something called the Experiment for International Living, what he had done when he was in college. So he knew the power of sending young people abroad and knew the power of what they would learn and bring back. So he was asked to create the Peace Corps out of nothing. No blueprint, no budget, no place in the government. And he creates it, which again shows this incredible brain power, strategy. He's a guy that was very shrewd as far as getting things done from nothing. And he did this again with the Johnson administration against the war against poverty. Creates it out of nothing. And it endures for 50 years, and a lot of people think it's the greatest hallmark of the Kennedy administration.
Well, it was the decade when poverty fell most sharply in the 20th century.
From 65 to 75, talk about this, the child poverty rate was almost what it is today, 25%. 1 in 4 kids living in poverty. The senior rate was a little higher, 28%. 10 years later, they had both been knocked down by 10%. Today, the
10 percentage points.
10 percentage points, I'm sorry, excuse me, yes.
No.
And then today, the senior rate of poverty is under 10%. And the kid rate, children under 18, is back up where it was in 1965, which to me shows if you have a political will and you invest in these efforts to eradicate poverty or lower poverty rates, it can be done. We just don't have the political will today. And the track record shows it, from 65 to 75, substantial drop in rates for both senior citizens and kids.
And so when he leaves first, the 60s behind him, he then accepts an invitation from George McGovern to run for vice president. He's never run for public office before, right? I mean, this is...
That's correct.
He's inaugurated into running for public office as vice president of the United States. That's fairly bold in and of itself for him to take on. And yet he's self-deprecating about the whole process because he knows that other people had been talked to. There was a wonderful phrase about your father used. Can you...
Well, he was evidently the 7th pick for McGovern. And there were 7 of us in the family. And my father always called us the Lucky 7. So right after the campaign was over, he bought a boat, a little motorboat, and he called it the Lucky 7, which everyone thought was ironic because he had gotten crushed in the campaign with McGovern. But as he said to McGovern after the 72 race, we may have lost the election, George, but we didn't lose our souls. And the people that beat him were out a couple years later when Nixon and Agnew were both gone. So they clearly got whooped, except for in Massachusetts. And as a kid, I just remember that bumper sticker that said, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts." I'm like, wow, a couple people. The only other place was D.C., but I didn't see any D.C. bumper stickers. I guess it was just Massachusetts.
I want to talk to you about 2 other things, about faith, again, and then about your father's Alzheimer's and how you cope with that. But I'd like to take a break just for a couple minutes and show a short clip that tells the audience a little bit more about your father and lets them see him.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got this monitor down here.
Mr. Shriver, do you really believe that poverty can be wiped out?
Yes, I do. I disagree with those who feel that grinding poverty, the kind of poverty I mean is the kind of poverty where you have very bad medical care, very bad housing.
Some Washington insiders called him a Boy Scout, an unabashed dreamer.
His enthusiasm, his idealism were unadulterated.
But beneath his buttery surface, wrote one reporter, was a second skin of steel.
He was the best all-around politician I've ever seen.
Yet today, he's all but forgotten, overshadowed as an in-law of the nation's most powerful political family.
There are too many Kennedys in public office right now. How do you personally answer that question?
Well, I say my name is Shriver.
Robert Sargent Shriver. From the summit of privilege and power, he dared America's youth to work among the poorest people in the world and live out their country's most revolutionary ideals.
Letting their actions speak for their hearts and for their minds and for this country.
There was the sense of something new was emerging, and that whatever it was, the Peace Corps was in the vanguard.
The Peace Corps became the symbol of American idealism abroad. But when Shriver was asked to fight poverty at home, his methods became a threat to politicians everywhere.
For the first time in the history of this country, poor people actually have a place and a way in which to express themselves.
He fed the attack dogs that went yapping incessantly after the establishment.
He was the golden boy, and now all of a sudden He's running into political resistance from every quarter.
It doesn't smack well with me, and it's more or less rebellion you had down there.
And I don't apologize to anybody, anywhere.
All these criticisms coming out. You're doomed to fail. You're too messianic.
It was a time of hope and change, amid a decade of conflict and rage, war and rebellion. And from deep within the political establishment, Shriver launched a string of social inventions that shaped an era and allowed a generation to live out its ideals.
Peace Corps, VISTA, legal services to the poor, Head Start.
He's probably had an effect on more Americans and more people across the world than anyone who hasn't been a president or a world leader, and probably even more than some of them.
You go around the campuses now, there's more anti-hunger groups on the campuses, more housing programs. You should start with where you are, right here in your campus.
For Shriver, the Peace Corps, the war on poverty, and America were acts of the imagination. They were ways that we should see and therefore be in the world.
Very bad housing, very bad education. That kind of poverty does not need to exist in the United States any longer. It can be wiped out.
Talk to me about your father's illness, about Alzheimer's, and how that came into his life and what it did to him and to you and your family.
I'm happy to do that. Can I comment on that thing, or
Absolutely.
are we going to go back to that?
No, go.
So I just want to point out that the guy that said that he was the best politician he had ever seen was Bill Moyers, who was LBJ's right-hand guy and who worked obviously for Dad and for President Kennedy. So it's a pretty incredible, comment from Moyers. The other thing is that the concept of that threat to politician, to political structure. I just want to say one thing about that because it just jumps at me. The one thing I did learn in this book as I was writing it, I never really contextualized, even though I was a history major, I never really contextualized what it must have been like in the mid-'60s to give federal money to poor people, right? I mean, you're giving federal money to poor African-American people to teach their kids to get into kindergarten ready to learn and Head Start, and they had been shortchanged in the education system forever, and the universities were segregated, right? And he was giving money directly to them, bypassing the political structure and giving it to poor people. And that's why Senator Stennis there is going crazy, because he didn't get his hands on the money, and the governors didn't get his hands on his money. I did a little book party the other day, and a guy in the front row said, I was a mid-level staffer for Head Start in Arkansas in 1966, and the governor out there reamed me, yelled at me. He wanted the money. Couldn't believe I was giving it to African-American people. And I went to the Head Start office, and your father didn't know who I was. And he got a phone call from the governor. And he said, yep, that's fine. Thanks very much. He'll be doing exactly what he's doing. And he hung up on him. And I got word that your father had backed me up and told me to keep giving the money to the poor people and forget the governor. That took guts. I mean, you talk about the audacity of hope. Imagine giving poor people, right, the ability to sue, to have a lawyer that they could never afford, and the government's paying for that lawyer, and the lawyer's then turning around and suing the government because the government has been unfair and unjust. I mean, that is pretty radical. And people say he's as I said, very nice guy and like a Boy Scout, but to try to take those efforts to help poor people educate their kids, have legal rights in this country, have job opportunities through Upward Bound, takes a lot of guts.
And to give them power.
And give them power, yeah. And people know, and we know that people that have power don't like giving up power.
Right.
And he went against the political structure to give the poor people those rights and that chance in life, which is really important. And I just want to note that. As far as Alzheimer's, it's a brutal disease. It is devastating, tens of thousands of families in this country right now, both emotionally and financially, and it was no different from us. I was in charge of Dad's legal and medical issues for the last 10 years of his life, and I clearly couldn't have done, that without the support of my entire family. My brother's sister, their spouses, nieces and nephews, my kids, my wife Jeannie, it's a family thing, or else it just is devastating. And as a country, we don't spend enough money on investing to find a cure for Alzheimer's. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars, which is a lot, but when you look at the financial implications, it's devastating, and we need to do more on that. There are also, these moments of, great insight that you get in Alzheimer's, or I got in Alzheimer's, and I tell a story in the book of being in church once, and my father had this thing where he used to blow in his hands all the time. He'd blow his nose, and sometimes he'd have tissue, sometimes he wouldn't, and you'd kind of go, oh God, it's brutal. And I remember being in Mass, and he started blowing his nose, and just thinking, oh God, I'm going to get a cold, and the kid's going to get a cold, and the whole thing's going to take a month, and it's going to be terrible. And he put his hand on my knee, and I just looked at it, and then he turned to me like 2 minutes later and just said, I love you. So, it's like, oh, that's a powerful thing for whatever I was, 46-year-old man, to realize that his father still loves him, and is still, trying to be a father despite that stuff. So Alzheimer's is brutal, but it also has these moments of insight that are really profound.
Thanks. I want to invite the audience to come forward and ask some questions on any of the things that we've discussed.
And if I get them wrong, the Harvard professor will answer them correctly.
Harvard degree holder over here, so I'm not going to buy that at all. So
nobody's got a question?
Nobody's got a question. I think we have questions coming. Come on over to the microphones.
Hello.
Go ahead. Yep.
So my name's Ray Sean. I just graduated from Babson College. With the amount of information that's available at our fingertips today, it's really easy for young people to become cynical. What suggestions do you have for young people to kind of get involved and affect policy around poverty, both here and abroad?
So I think there is a lot of information out there to become cynical. There's also an incredible amount of information not to become cynical. And a lot of the young folks that I talk to, want to change the world, and they see technology as a way to do that. And I don't know, about the technology because I'm old. The whole Twitter thing.
You'll love the Telegraph. We'll talk afterwards.
It's a Harvard professor with humor. It's good. So I think, the bottom line is I was in elected office for 8 years. If you go down to a state government, if you are interested in making change in state government, and you get a couple of your friends involved in that, you can really change policy on a state level. Because there's nothing that politicians pay more attention to than votes and dough, right? And if you can show up with other people who vote and will do something to threaten their existence or get them reelected, they're on you. And the other way is to put money into the political system. And if you just graduated from Babson, I don't think you're probably writing a check for $1 million like the guys in Vegas are doing. So I think the way to make a difference is to mobilize. And it's discouraging, and if you get 5 or 10 people, it may seem like you're not making a difference. But I can tell you as a state rep, when 5 or 10 people show up at your door and say they're interested in X or Y, you listen. So I think young people can make a humongous difference, but you got to get involved, and you got to be tenacious about it. I mean, one of the things about Dad is when he was on it, he was really on it and focused and worked. You got to really work. And you got to stay after politicians. A lot of politicians will not lead; they'll follow, and because they're afraid of getting out front on an issue. We're in a place that honors somebody who got out in front on issues, but most politicians don't. And President Kennedy did, but most will follow. So they're going to follow your example if you get to them.
Over here.
I think there's got to be some Peace Corps volunteers here.
I don't know. I didn't take roll call, but I bet you there are.
I was in the Peace Corps from 67 to 69 in Malaysia.
Great.
And I saw President Carter at a book signing. And I said to him, I was in the Peace Corps. And he instantly said to me, how'd you like it? My mother liked it. And he was so sweet. But I would think there's some Peace Corps. My nephew was in the Peace Corps recently for 3 years in Panama. And I love my nephew anyway, but I loved him for doing that.
Thank you.
And
he was always got going quicker when he was around Peace Corps volunteers. He loved the Peace Corps and loved the work that they were doing all around the world.
It was in Malaysia that I was, and it was a very progressive country. I think it is still today.
And Dad was always very proud of Mrs. Carter, too. Yeah. She was a little older when she went into the Peace Corps. She was like 70 or something.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, over here.
Mark, I'm interested in how your father's example influenced your choices of how you're spending your life and your career, et cetera, and your recent work with Save the Children.
So just for full disclosure, I know Brad, and he's on the board of Save the Children. So he's.
This is one of the plants that you were talking about. When do we go to the audience? I got it.
No,
right,
I didn't know he was.
And you missed the meeting yesterday, Mark. By the way.
I'm on a book tour. I apologize. I did not know he was going to be here, honestly. I think, when you admire your parents, and my mom and dad both gave two different examples of how to make a difference. One worked within the government, creating Head Start, Job Corps, Legal Services, the Peace Corps as part of the federal government. The other one worked outside of the government, creating Special Olympics with no government funding. So I think there are all sorts of different ways to make a contribution, and I've tried the nonprofit route, where I'm now working for Save the Children. I started a program for juvenile delinquent kids in Baltimore City. And I've tried the elected route, being in the state legislature in Maryland for 8 years. And I think being elected is a great honor, and you can make a difference. It's also got a lot of constraints on it that I don't think it had in the 60s or 50s. So I think there are all sorts of different ways. So I'm enjoying what I'm doing now, which is being in the nonprofit arena, working in 200 schools across this country, teaching young kids how to read. All of whom are all the kids are living in poverty, and making sure that they're trying to live healthy lifestyles. So I think it's a step, in the same vein as what my father did, but obviously to create and do what he did, I have no illusions that I'm going to do that, which I'm totally fine with. Trying, as he said, to do the best you can with what God's given you. And the Save the Children is obviously a wonderful organization, has been around for over 80 years. But when you see two people doing that, it does encourage you or push you into that area.
Over here. Thank you.
My name is Hannah. I was born and raised in Ghana. And I was just curious whether you know why Ghana was selected as the first country to receive the Peace Corps service in West Africa. It makes such a great positive impact. But I also want people to know that I think the sensitivity that President Kennedy showed towards poor people and the role that your father played was just so key, because most African countries supply a lot of raw materials around the world, and I think it's a world of interdependence. And so even though Ghana was the first to get their independence, it was plunged into a lot of poverty because of the way colonization was, like 100 years of British colonization. So in that aspect, I was wondering, is that the reason why Ghana was selected first? And the fact that I think fellow Americans have to know that we depend so much on other countries for raw materials, and it's appropriate when we exchange services.
Well, it's a great question, and I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I don't know why it was chosen. You gave a beautiful explanation, but I don't know for sure.
Right, okay.
And I'd be happy to look into that and get back to you, but I don't know the answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, though.
Well, hi there, and I really love both your books, actually. Galbraith, too, and Mr. Shriver, your book was incredible. I think anybody reading it who had a relative with Alzheimer's can barely get through it without getting quite choked up, actually. And I love that two great books on your father have come out in the last few years. I'm wondering, though, is anyone going to do that for your equally extraordinary mother? Is anybody working on a book on her at all?
Do you want to write it, or? She deserves it. I think the really interesting thing about my mother and father was that they never, wanted to write a book about themselves. And somebody asked me this yesterday. I was over at City Year, and Michael Brown, the head of City Year, actually gave some beautiful words on Dad and said that they were so proud when they first started up. They had a bumper sticker that said City Year, the Urban Peace Corps. And about 3 months after they had created that bumper sticker, the Peace Corps called them up and threatened them. And they were so excited that the Peace Corps even knew they existed. So the answer, and somebody else asked the question about it, and I said, you know, my parents never talked about a legacy. They were never worried about how the history would treat them. They weren't worried about getting their story out there, about writing their perspective on things, which in a certain way is beautiful. And the other way, it's too bad because they didn't get to say it for history's sake to help the rest of us try to figure it out. There are people that are now writing a biography on my mom, but nobody, you know, within our 5 siblings are looking at it right now at this point. I don't, you know, this thing really did my brother, as I mentioned, after Dad died, I was like, you know, what happens now? What do I do? I mean, all these people saying he's a good man. I don't know what to do. And my brother Timmy said, well, start writing. And that's what this is. It was just, you know, writing to try to figure it out, writing to look at his letters. And, you know, that may happen with one of my siblings. I hope it does, because my mom is an incredibly unique story unto herself, and a very good woman as well. Thank you for the question, though.
I'm David Squire, and I had the honor of running the Job Corps. Sargent Shriver hired me, asked me to come down and do that. And I used to spend often Sunday nights at Timberlawn. I don't think you were born, but your little siblings
I was around.
were there.
Yeah, I was little.
This was in 1966.
I was 2.
Okay.
I'm glad I left an impression on you.
I think you were in bed.
He was upstairs reading. That's
yes. And I apologize, I don't have a question, but I do need to make a couple of comments. You know, when Sargent Shriver started the, as you say, the War on Poverty and the Peace Corps, he actually ran both at the same time. He'd spend the morning over at the Peace Corps, and it's a few blocks away, and then he'd be back at our shop for the afternoon. He was the most inspirational man. Sorry. For me.
Thank you.
He was a great listener. He was a devil's advocate where he'd probe everything, kept asking questions, was hungry for information, thirsty for it, took it all in, didn't feel that he had all the answers, but he had all the questions.
He was. He had that amazing ability. Thank you. That was. I really appreciate it. If I could just say one thing on that, I mean, I think, thank you for those comments. Really appreciate them. And you're absolutely right. He would listen. And a lot of people, you know, Jeannie Main, who you may have met, worked for Dad from actually 72 on, said that she worked for him for whatever that was, 35 years. And I said, that's a long time. And she said, you know, there are a lot of people, high-powered lawyers in Washington that never listen to anybody that works in their office, much less the secretary, never listen to their ideas. Your dad always asked me my opinion on things, and he didn't do what I suggested all the time, but he listened. I think that's a really important point. And particularly a lot of, you know, great men and great women, when these lights go off and the TV cameras are away, they don't listen to really anybody, and they don't, you know, treat people the same way they do as when the lights are on, and he was very consistent on that. So thank you. That was a great point.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Baragis. During my adult life, my voting time, I have seen the Republican Party morph into something very different. Recently, Jeb Bush commented that his own father and President Reagan would not be embraced by today's Republican Party. And I'm wondering, have you seen the Democratic Party have a similar shift? To what extent? And how do you feel that your dad and his generation of Kennedys would fit in with today's Democratic Party?
So I think that what you saw with my father was obviously a guy who believed in the Democratic Party. Although, as I tell in the story, and as we alluded to, he was born in Maryland, which was a states' rights place, and his heroes at that point were all limited government people. And as he told me countless times, the reason the federal government got as involved as they did in issues like the Peace Corps or poverty in the U.S., legal services, was because no one had stepped in to provide legal representation to poor people, didn't have lawyers. The education systems was so broken down that the federal government had to stand in and do something about it. I think what you find, what I believe is that the people, both Republicans and Democrats 40, 50 years ago, had differences. Campaigns were brutal, always have been in this country, and it's the arena where you exchange ideas and you fight for your ideas. So I don't want to sugarcoat that and say that in the past it was nice, because it wasn't. They were tough. But I think in the past, when push came to shove and the country had a problem, I think people were willing to compromise in order for the good of the country. And I think what today we see on both sides is the question, am I better off today than I was 4 years ago? And although there's a strain in this country clearly of individualism, I think that individualism was always tempered by an approach to what was best for the community, and the community being the country. And the people, this is a place where anybody can do whatever they want, but ultimately we were all, more concerned about how the country was doing rather than my bank account and whether it was better today than it was yesterday. So I think there was more willingness on both sides. First President Bush, they talk about that in this new movie on him. I think, and Tip O'Neill and Reagan would go out and have a drink and try to hammer things out. They don't agree everything politically, but I think there was this more of an effort around community. And when I say community, I mean the country. So I think that they would, my dad, I think, was disappointed that there was this, splintering on both sides and there wasn't this conversation going on. And I hope we can get back to that.
Your father's biographer, Scott Stossel, observed that his wife, who's Roman Catholic, said to him once that there were two kinds of Roman Catholics in America, Shriver Catholics and Santorum Catholics, and we needed more Shriver Catholics in America to rebuild that sense of community.
If I can just say one thing about that. I think the dad's idea of faith, he was clearly Roman Catholic. But what I think, and I found this speech in there that I had never seen before, and he said it in 1966. And he called on the end about, it was this discussion of the separation of church and state. And he said the wall was there so that the government wouldn't get in the pulpit, not that the people in the pulpit wouldn't get out and help the poor. And as the head of the government war to eradicate poverty, he was calling upon Rabbi Hirsch, Father Kelly, and Reverend Smith to get involved in the fight to do our Father's business, capital O, capital F. And I was like, wow, that's pretty radical, crazy stuff in there. And I think what he was always interested in was if you were interested in essentially called the social justice, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, he wanted to work with you. And he didn't care whether you were Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or Muslim or agnostic or atheist. I think Scott, his biographer, is an atheist. He said it publicly, so I'm not letting anything out of the bag. But the bottom line is, Daddy wanted to work with you if you were interested in doing the work that made a difference in people's lives, whether it was helping the poor in this country or abroad, or knocking down the walls of prejudice and misunderstanding against people with developmental disabilities, like he did with Special Olympics. I mean, he rolled Special Olympics into communist China. And the games were international. Special Olympic Games were in Shanghai before they were in Beijing. And he negotiated that. He was willing to do work with the communists of China as long as they were trying to help people with developmental disabilities, which they had not done a good job, and he advocated for that.
Over here.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
My name is Caroline. My sister is now with the Peace Corps for the past 3 years in Costa Rica. And thank you very much to you, to your family, and to the Peace Corps for having such a outstanding and interesting thing to be able to bring the best of America into places where the people need more help and more education, etc. My question is, said that you are going to be elected president of the United States, and I would like to know what do you will do in order to make education and healthcare better, and how people can know a little more to help about Alzheimer's.
Did you say if I got elected president of the United States? Okay. Well, that's a nice question, but My grandmother, which I told in this book, which you might recall, used to walk around, Grandma Kennedy would walk around and say, is it if I were president or if I was president? And then kids would all go, if I was president, because that sounds right. And then she'd go, no, if it's contrary to fact, it's were. And then she'd pause and go, dear, you're not president yet. So I'm not president yet, so I don't have an answer to your question. I mean, I think on the issue of Alzheimer's, let me just answer that. I think, there's a great association, the Alzheimer's Association. My sister's done a couple of movies and shows, rather, on it, on HBO. And getting the awareness out. When my father was formally diagnosed in 2000, late 2000, they gave him, put him on Aricept, which is a pill that's supposed to slow it down, but they don't even know if Aricept's effective. Right. And it was, wow, we don't know anything about this disease, and we've made some progress in it, but there's still so much unknown that I think we really, as a country, need to put more demand. The guy that asked the question about what kids could do, if your family's impacted by it, you ought to go tell your representatives about it, and that they ought to put more money in the research. I think we spend as a country $700 million on research, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you compare it to cancer, which I think is around the $7 billion mark, HIV/AIDS, I'm off on my numbers a little bit, but it's really nothing, and it's what it's doing financially to this country and to countless families, both those that have money and those that don't. It's going to really bankrupt us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your comments about
And this will be our last question, and then I want to ask Mark one final question.
Hi there.
Hi.
I have the great honor of working for the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, and you spoke recently at our event in Boston. I just wanted you to know how important your father's legacy is to the work of legal services today. And I just had the great experience just this week of showing a clip from that video, which I use a lot in our training programs to let the current generation of legal services lawyers know what our history is. And so my question is really, what is your advice, or what would your dad's advice be for the legal services movement today? It's lost some of the steam it had when he founded it. But many of us still look back to that and want to really transmit those values. So I'm just wondering what he would offer.
I love that.
us.
Did you show the video? We saw that first clip when the guy goes, I think it's Walter Cronkite, goes, do you really think you can eradicate poverty? And without missing a beat, he goes, yes, I do, right? I love that. I remember talking to my dad when he said, Kennedy said we're going to put a man on the moon. Everybody thought he was crazy. But the country rallied around that goal. And I think when President Johnson, said we're going to eradicate poverty or declare a war on poverty, people rallied around it. It may have been short-lived. You can argue whether the money was spent well, but the bottom line is the rates went down, and they went down on kid poverty rate. And a lot of politicians, to go back to your question, talk about how important kids are. Mm-hmm. They're our most important, resource, and then they don't invest in programs that will make a difference in kids' lives. So I think if that's what you're alluding to, my point is that if we don't hold them accountable, politicians, to really investing in our poor kids, we're just going to have this continuing separation between the wealthy and the poor, and that's going to affect the entire country. And I think that's what's outrageous right now, is that the richest country in the history of the world, 1 in 4 kids almost is living in poverty.
Mark, I want to thank you for coming here today. I learned more about your father and believe that you're absolutely right, that he was a good man. I think he has every reason to be a proud father, too.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you.